All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me here on Question the Rules.
Like you said, I don't know if there's a specific moment. There's a couple that I could think of. There's two facets to it, I guess, for me. One was similar to you. My father was someone who struggled with depression, with alcoholism, with addiction. And it was different. He wasn't violent at all. He was completely passive and vacant. It was like he didn't exist, like he wasn't there, or he didn't have a presence. And from a young age, you kind of pick up on the fact you're not supposed to talk about that, certainly outside the four walls of your home, or you're not supposed to bring that conversation anywhere. And it wasn't even really talked about in the four walls of my home. It was just obvious. It was just there, and you observed it, and that was it. And so from a young age, I kind of picked up on there's some level of shame, or at the very least secrecy, about this, and this isn't a conversation topic to really explore. And then for me, I went through experiences as a young kid where I really struggled with depression, and I had no tools for how to deal with that, but I also just didn't have a mindset for how to deal with that. I didn't think I could talk about it. I didn't think I should talk about it. And so I kind of lived this, I put up a lot of walls so no one could see it, no one could see in. And I thought that kept me safe, which is the great illusion, is you put up all these walls and then no one can see you, but you can't see out at a certain point. And so for years, for about 4 years, I lived that way, and it reached a breaking point where I was a 17-year-old kid, and I hit this suicidal rock bottom on a particular day and wrote a suicide note, and genuinely just didn't have a vision for my life that kind of extended past that exact moment in time. And that was a different type of awakening, because I think when you're just struggling with it consistently, there's this element where you become numb to it, and it does become a new normal, and you kind of accept it in these ways, whether that's out of fear or shame or who knows. And so for me, that was this moment where I go, yeah, this is a real problem. If I don't want to be alive, that's an issue, obviously. And it took that for me to really wake up to it.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I've talked to a lot of guys where I'll ask them the question, do you think you have to hit rock bottom before things get better?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I know for myself in my life, I had that story.
Yeah.
I believe this story of like, I'm gonna bottom out before I start to rise up again. And I see that as a common thread with a lot of guys, where they have this internal belief of life has to fundamentally be destroyed and fall apart before I can start to repair. And I think that there's a, part of this conversation, hopefully, is like there are different ways to go about that. We don't always have to bottom out to spring back up.
I had an experience when I was younger. I've got a sister that's 4 years my junior, and I had experiences with babysitters, both male and female, where sexual predation was involved. And a piece of that for me was submitting to a male babysitter at the age of 7 in order to save my younger sister. And so for me, that was the real break with my mental health, because I established at that time that loving another person was something that made me weak. Caring about another person was something that put me in danger, it was something that put me in jeopardy. So I constructed a persona that was hard, that was uncaring, that was unfeeling, that just didn't give a damn. And this was at the age of 7, those seeds were sown. And so I was in a place within myself that was closed off and shut off. And I didn't have anybody around me, number one, that knew about that or had the tools to see that there were some symptoms there, there were some signs there were some destructive behaviors that I was engaging in, but it was, pawned off as, oh, he's just being a boy. Boys will be boys. And if it was something that was a little too out of line, well, just beat his ass. And so that was my relationship to mental health at a young age. I was an athlete, so that allowed me to hide based off of what people saw on the field. I was able to create another persona, something else to hide behind. You know, people saw, my prowess on the field, and it was like, okay, that's him right there. They didn't see the real me. And an episode occurred where a friend and I wrecked his mom's car, stole his mom's car and wrecked his car. And so sports were eliminated from my life. And so I went out into the gutter and picked up gangbanging. That compounded my mental health issues because that culture taught me and trained me and took advantage of what I had learned as a youngster, the sternness, the hardness, the uncaring, the unfeeling. It was able to capitalize on what was already inside of me, the seeds that were already there. And that allowed me to thrive and flourish in destructive criminal lifestyles, the underground world. And eventually it led to multiple years of incarceration. I did 2 stints in what they call California Youth Authority. That's boys' prison. I went there twice before the age of 18. And I got out. The second time I got out, I was out for 21 days and committed crimes in the community that netted me a life sentence. I was sentenced to 17 years, running consecutive with 7 to life. I ultimately did 24 years in the California prison system. I came back out into the community in 2014. So I'm now, 4.5, 5 years removed from incarceration. While inside, I was found by an organization called Inside Circle. Following another stint in the hole, I was in solitary confinement for attempting to kill another man, stabbed him quite a few times. My wife asked me not to say how many times. And while I was in the hole, I was in a unit that also housed Charles Manson and Sirhan. And they were in solitary as well, but they were allowed to go out and engage with other people, engage with other humans without restraints. I had gotten to a point with the things I had done in my life up to then, where everywhere I went, I was in belly chains and shackles. I was on what they call standalone, walk-alone status. That meant anywhere that I went, I had a guard on either side of me, and the gunner was following with a Mini 14. And once I got out onto the yard by myself, they'd take off the shackles. And there was a moment where I'm sitting there and I'm like, damn, Charles Manson and Sirhan, 2 of the most infamous people in California prison history. This dude, Charles convinced people to massacre other people, but they're allowing him around other people. And I can't go anywhere around other people. Something about this just doesn't sit right. I don't know what needs to change or how it needs to change, but that opened me up to being willing to try something new. The rules that I've seen in my experience is, number 1, that men don't cry. Men don't have emotions. The only emotion that men in my circles, the men that I have experience with, are allowed to express and be respected is anger. And generally that anger is served best in the form of rage. If I'm raging, that's masculine. That means I'm a man. That means I'm strong. Anything short of that, happiness, fear, sadness, no, that's weakness.
For me, I think maybe that we have a hard time being willing to learn. And I think the way I grew up, not having a father figure present at all, I was just afraid to ask people for help about anything. And I think that you kind of come up with these weird ideas about who it's okay to learn stuff from and who it's not okay to learn stuff from. And there were people in my life who could see what I was going through and would try and reach out and help me. And I couldn't accept it, not because I didn't want to change, not even because I didn't feel like I had a problem or I didn't have the self-awareness or whatever, just literally because I felt like that wasn't okay, and that was somehow weak to accept help from someone else. And I think it wasn't modeled to me to be mentored or to have anyone who's a little bit further along down the path maybe share something with you or share an insight with you that could help you. So I didn't know what that really meant. So I just rejected everything and thought that I could maybe build my identity around I figured all this out on my own. And I think I kind of still struggle with that to this day a little bit, where it almost means more to me to do something without any help, even though it's illogical, even though I know that that's not the best way to live your life, even though I know that's not helpful, even though I know all this stuff intellectually. There's this part of my ego almost that goes, yeah, but I did that all on my own. And there's this part of you that just goes, that loves that.
And then listening to you, my language for what you're describing is that you learn to be anti-dependent, needless and wantless. I'll take care of it myself, which is also very masculine. But it's very masculine because all of us boys needed somebody to take care of us, and we were told to take care of it on our own, or it wasn't addressed. Well, let me have my martini and then I'll talk to you.
Yeah.
And you learn not to depend on anybody because there's nobody dependable to depend upon. We talk about the masculine code and masculine culture, but we forget it's not some abstract principle. That masculine code comes to you through the drunk father who doesn't tend to your worries or your tears. That code comes from the violent father who hits you with a belt and tells you to stop crying. The code of masculinity is transmitted to us through people, through other boys, through teachers, and most emphatically through our parents. People say about my work, it really pisses me off actually. People say I'm trying to feminize men or I'm trying to undo masculinity. That is bullshit. I don't think there's anybody doing men's work that wants to turn men into women.
No.
I think that is a troglodyte's response. What I want from the guy, John Bradshaw said 1,000,000 years ago, pass it back or pass it on. And I want us to sift through the legacy of what we've been handed, keep what's good, and put to rest what's toxic.
Now, I think what stymies the conversation is the idea of masculinity and people tying masculinity to manhood. Two different things, two very different things. All males have aspects of masculinity, but all males aren't men. And so in the work that we do, what we seek to do is identify what's mine and what's somebody else's. So if somebody is talking about toxic masculinity and I'm a man and there are aspects of my maleness that just will not allow me to engage in certain toxic aspects, you're not talking about me. You're not attacking me. That's your shit. It doesn't stick to me. So that's, in my opinion, what is stymieing the conversation. There's a defense that as soon as men hear toxic masculinity, they think that they are being attacked. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not attacking anybody. What I'm talking about are, again, those aspects that as males, we tend to take on and define as masculine, and where in there are there aspects that are toxic? Where in there are there aspects that I need to disregard and pick up the positive attributes? That, for me, is where the conversation is at. And in my experience where I have seen it, again, it goes to this script, this unwritten script about what makes a man, what defines a man. And oftentimes that script that's passed down, that's handed down, is warped, it's twisted. And so the work for me is to get in there and tear away those pieces, everything that's been passed down and handed down, pick it up, look at it, question it, and see, does this fit me?
The reason why we're in so much trouble these days is because we've been offensive. And we have to deal with those offensive parts of masculinity and embrace the more relational parts.
initiation, ushering young males into manhood it's mandatory in order to have the next generation come up and be healthy males.
I do want to say this, in our current world, it's really important, I believe, to not limit the mentorship of boys to men. Single women can raise boys, lesbian parents can raise boys. You don't need a boy to turn a boy into a man. You need an adult to turn a child into an adult. So a lot of folks in the men's movement are really about only a man can raise a man. And I want to empower the women with sons to feel perfectly competent to do that initiation as well.
One thing that I think is kind of more prevalent now than ever is there's so many different ways to get pleasure. There's so many ways to forget distraction. There's so many ways to kind of lose yourself and just tune out from yourself. And I think that's a way bigger issue than anyone talks about. And it's kind of as though, I've thought about it before, if you don't learn how to lead yourself, the world just leads you around. And I think people are falling into these different addictions and really dark, hopeless kind of places because they don't have a mission or they don't have a purpose or they haven't actually been able to have any real conversations with people about what that looks like. And so you just find yourself seeking pleasure. And then when that doesn't work, you seek distraction from the fact that you're not feeling good. And there's just all these ways now to get outside of yourself, but you lose yourself in that. And I think that's one reason we don't have a lot of these conversations about mental health is because people are so busy distracting themselves. They forget that why they're distracting themselves in the first place, right?
And I always like to speak from the I perspective for self. The biggest block is the emotion of fear. Fear of being ridiculed, fear of being seen as weak, fear of standing out and going against the grain, going against the norm. And for me, the way to get beyond that is to start to grow beyond, the bullshit talk. We can sit around and talk about going to the bar and somebody's got their eye on a girl across the room and everybody can sit there and keep score, keep tally. We can talk about that for hours. Ask the question, okay, yeah, we want to talk about women. Tell me about the first time you fell in love with a woman and got your heart broke. That's a conversation to have because then that opens the door to start going into the emotional intelligence and starting to share because people go through things like that. They just don't talk about them. They'll go somewhere and lock up in an apartment or something for 6 months and nobody will see them. And then they come back out and they've got the good face on and they're all strong. But you were just sitting in there going through a whole bunch of shit and never talked about it with anybody. Let's sit down and have that conversation. The first thing that comes to my mind is something you spoke about earlier. The piece about asking for help is huge. Asking for help. I don't know everything. I don't have access to everything. I need other people. I need connection. That, for me, is number one.
How common it really is, you know what I mean? And how everyone's dealing with that. And people can say that they're not, but that's not real either, and I think that's a huge piece. But I think the other piece comes back to something we've kind of touched on a little bit, which is just ego. And I think I noticed this really funny thing where I can't open up to someone that I don't respect as another man. But if I do respect another man, then I'm suddenly like competing with him. You know what I mean? So it's like, I can't respect this guy and open up to him. But then this guy who I can, it has to always be this, you're constantly like, I think you use the words of proving your masculinity over and over again. And even when that isn't intentional, or I wouldn't say that that's intentional, or I wouldn't even identify as the type of person who does that. But then you notice it, right? You notice yourself just so eager to share a certain thing that might make yourself look a certain way, and you're always posturing, and you're always trying to put your recent success or whatever it may be forward. And I think a lot of that comes down to ego and then fear, and fear of who you really are without all the external stuff and without what this person says about you or without what you've done or without what mountain you've climbed or thing you've built or whatever. Who are you really? And I think sometimes that's scary because we put so much time in those external things. Maybe we're not that amazing internally. And I think that's something I've really struggled with and still kind of continue to struggle with is just being able to connect with someone on a real level without always feeling like you need to prove something, and also without feeling that fear of, is this enough? And I think those are things that we just don't learn and we just don't talk about.
Give up your obsession with strength. Be a whole, real human being, and learn about intimacy. See, traditional masculinity cuts us away from intimacy. And people say that men are afraid of intimacy. I don't believe that. Men are afraid of domination. In the world of men, you're one up or one down, winner or loser. Every man listening to this knows what I'm talking about. And it's what you every time you walk into a room, you're evaluating who's above me, who's below me, how's my performance. I'd like people to just get rid of all that shit and be with what's in front of your face.
Yeah.
And don't be above it and don't be below it, but just be with it. Men need to learn what with means, and that's my wish for men.